Okay, so the next lecture in our series here in Mark is we're still kind of thinking, we're still talking about Galilean ministry, because the Galilean ministry really goes from the prologue all the way from like chapter 1 verse 14, Galilean ministry, all the way through 8:30. Now we've been amping it up in this class and not just talking about the Galilean ministry as a whole, but we've been talking about the Galilean ministry in greater detail. So we talked about the early Galilean ministry, we talked about the late Galilean ministry, we talked about ministry around Galilee, and now as he finishes his work primarily around Galilee, we're going to talk about this as a turning point in Jesus' ministry. And I'll make sure and get you a nice picture of Dr. Paul Hill's outline for this section so that you can see that. We've got some interesting stuff in this passage in chapter 8, verses 22 through 30, which is the turning point in Jesus' ministry. And so your readings that are assigned in the syllabus are going to be very helpful here in relationship to the messianic issues, because that's certainly the highlight of what's going on in this section. Unfolding, unraveling, talking about what exactly does it mean for Jesus to be the Messiah, and the disciples' continuing struggles to understand exactly what that means. You know, they've got that Second Temple messianic expectation, and we're gonna dive in deeper on that than we've ever done before, and look at some primary resources to help us better understand that and reinforce that understanding, so we'll have a clear idea. So chapter 8, verses 23 through 30 is the final portion of the Galilean ministry, which runs from chapter 1, verse 14 through chapter 8, verse 30. It's the capstone section on teaching in relationship to that cyclical outline that I gave you. I said it's from David Garland, which starts with a series of conflict and then rejection and then teaching. And then we have another round of that in Mark, again with conflict. And so here we're finishing that the first round, ending with the last section on teaching. And then we're getting ready to start that final conflict section, which will culminate in Jesus' crucifixion. That's actually the rejection section. The teaching is just very brief. We'll come back and talk about that at the end of the book. So I'm going to read now in chapter 8. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 8 all the way through chapter 9, verse 1, so we can hear this whole section in one reading. And I'll see if I can get the biblical passage on the screen for you so you can follow along. But I really hope you have your Bible and you're following along in your Bible. Again, I'm without my classroom Bible, but I've got my handy dandy ESV, and it'll do just fine here. Okay. Okay. So starting in Mark chapter 8, verse 22. Let's begin reading there. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to Jesus a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and he led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. He sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days arise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside, and he began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain? The whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And he said to them, Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power. This is the word of the Lord. All right, now let's dig into that. This is one of my most favorite passages in all of the biblical text, and definitely in Mark. This 8:22 through 9:1. I also like the end of chapter 10 and the healing of the other blind man that puts a capstone on the other side of this, or a bookend on the other side of this. But it all starts right here in chapter 8, verses 23 through 26, with the healing of a blind man. Now, if you pay attention, and I know you are, if you pay attention to the stories in Mark, we've had a lot of healings and a lot of exorcisms. But you will notice that after this point, after they turn towards Jerusalem, there are very few healings that are talked about and very few exorcisms that are talked about. And the focus really is on Jesus' teaching and on his conflict, and then finally on the rejection of the religious elite of Jesus. This healing here, the healing of the blind man, look again at verses 22 through 26. I'm tempted to go ahead and read it again to you, but we'll talk about it in enough detail that probably won't be necessary. But look at verse 22. They came to Bethsaida. Now Bethsaida, that's on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's the hometown of a couple of the disciples. That's where Jesus called them from. It's a town that's been excavated. We've excavated the town from the time of Jesus. I've actually visited that excavation back in the 90s, and they were still doing some digging and some research there. Probably still are. It's a fantastic town. It's a fishing town, even though it's not right on the coast. It's just, you can definitely see the water from there, and it is just a great Eastern Galilee town. But notice the healing here. Jesus does something normally, and normally Jesus doesn't use stuff to do healings or exorcisms. In fact, we've talked about that, how typically Jesus just speaks and people are healed. But here he takes and he spits in his hand, and he takes some of the saliva and he wipes it on the eyes of the guy, and ask him if he can see. This is how he chooses to heal him. If you look at verse 23, you can see where it talks about the saliva and how he used his hands to touch him. And then he asked the guy if he can see. And the guy says, yeah, I can see a little bit now, but all the people around me are, I don't know if he's trying to say they're blurry or what, but he says they're walking around. They look like trees walking around. So he doesn't see clearly. And so Jesus touches him again. Doesn't mention, I don't think, whether saliva was used this time again, but Jesus puts, well, if you want to talk about it in real simple terms, Jesus has to give this guy a second whammy. Now, what's going on here? Is Jesus low on manna? Y'all know I love my wow. Is he low on manna? Is his blue bar all the way down and he's got to, drink some refreshing water or some nectar? to bring, or mage water would be best if you can get it. Is he got to drink that in order to get his mana back up to touch him? Or maybe Jesus is losing his touch. He doesn't have as much power, so he has to do a double whammy in order to get enough power. This is all goofy, isn't it? There's got to be something else going on here. Jesus is not losing power, and that's not the issue. So we need to look elsewhere. We should note, however, that this is the only miracle that's recorded in any of the Gospels that we might call a two-stage miracle. Partial healing, a break, even though it's brief, and then full healing. There isn't any other story like this at all in the Gospels. Now, and I don't think that Mark is fabricating this. I do think Mark is trying to tell us something. I do think he is trying to demonstrate a particular element and connect this story to what's about to happen. It's not really, I wouldn't call this an intercalation, but I would definitely call it, he's setting up the story and the discussion about the identity of Jesus. And he's connecting that to the disciples' understanding and knowledge of who Jesus is. So with this two-stage healing of the blind man, it's like the disciples have a partial knowledge of who Jesus is, but not a full knowledge. I think Mark is looking retrospectively at the stories about Jesus, and he sees something of significance, a correlation in this miracle, and he tries to use that to explain to us the identity of Jesus. He's writing it the way that it occurred, but he's interpreting the meaning of it by editing the text in this way. So remember, when we think about blindness and deafness in the Gospels, both of these disabilities, blindness and deafness, are often spiritualized or allegorized, if you will, in the biblical text to talk about the ability to comprehend spiritual truth. Jesus describes the Pharisees as being blind. He doesn't mean that they're literally blind, but they are figuratively blind. They're blind to the spiritual reality around them. And salvation is frequently seen as the equivalent to gaining one's sight, not just in the stories of the blind people, but in the lives of anyone who the salvation is gaining your true sight, gaining insight, gaining that true spiritual understanding. Both this story here of the healing of the blind man and the story of the healing of Bartimaeus, who is a blind man in the city of Jericho, that will come up in Mark at the end of chapter 10 as the last story in the journey to Jerusalem, right before Jesus enters into Jerusalem in chapter 11, verse 1. Both of these stories of blindness illustrate the blindness of the disciples. Remember, the journey to Jerusalem is about discipleship. And in Mark really emphasizes the disciples' slowness or their inability to see Jesus for who he truly is. They're blinded here even to the relationship between what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah and what it really means to be the Messiah. They don't understand, they cannot see how suffering and how persecution relates to Jesus being the Messiah, and they certainly don't understand how suffering and persecution relates to being a disciple or being a follower of Jesus, in spite of the fact that this is the true nature of discipleship. We get to that here. Looky here. We get to that here at the end of chapter 8, where Jesus says in verse 34, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel's will save it." He goes on, we can't save our soul. We can't give our lives up. It goes on. And so he's revealing the true nature of discipleship. But now listen, the 12, they don't get this yet. We wouldn't have gotten it either. because we would have been so ingrained in that messianic expectation. This healing takes place. This healing takes place against the disciples' continued struggle with the meaning of the loaves. If you look back in chapter 8, verses 14 through 21, especially verse 21, which says, and he said to them, do you not understand? Remember, he was just thrashing them with bread in chapter 8 there, verses 14 through 21. They don't understand what it means to be in Jesus' presence. They're still worrying about being hungry and having provisions and dealing with all this stuff. And they don't get it. But now, so we have the healing of the two-stage healing of the blind man. And then Jesus goes on to Caesarea Philippi, which is a great town built by Herod Philip, named in honor of the Caesar at the time, built in the at the northern side of the Sea of Galilee, way up north. I don't know, maybe 20 miles, 25 miles. I can't remember. It's the city is built on a giant spring. This spring is one of the four sources of the Jordan River, the north of the Sea of Galilee, that feeds and fills the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee, and then the Jordan River continuing all the way down to the Dead Sea, all the way down through this Jordan Rift that is through this whole area. So it's a significant city. It's built at a place of great water. It had been a city before this amongst the Canaanites. In fact, at one point, a small little kind of temple of the Greek god Pan, the shepherd god, the god of chaos and panic and disturbances. There's actually still a little place where his statue once stood, and you can go and see that. In fact, I've got a picture. Let me write that note down real quick. I'll put a picture here over me talking about this in the video, and you can see they don't currently have a statue there, but they do have a very glorious figure there. We'll let you can see that in the picture, I hope. And so Caesarea Philippi is a big important city, and you can climb up on the rock up above the cave where the spring comes out and look out over the city of Caesarea Philippi, and this is the traditional site of where this dialogue takes place. And so once they get there, then Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" All right, who do the people say that I am? Who are people talking about? And what's going on there? And they tell him, well, some people told him that you're John the Baptist. Remember, John the Baptist had been killed, so I guess the idea is that this is John the Baptist resuscitated. Some say that you're Elijah. Remember, Elijah, there's no record of his death. He's just taken away by a chariot of fire. And now he's returned. And in fact, Elijah was prophesied to return before the Messiah. So if they're thinking that Jesus is Elijah, then the Messiah comes after him. But the plain teaching of the New Testament is that John the Baptist should be understood as the fulfillment of the prophecy of the return of Elijah. And Jesus is indeed the Messiah. And then they even go on and say other people are just saying you're one of the prophets. You're not the Messiah. You're not the Messiah. You're not Elijah. You're not John the Baptist from the dead. You are just one of the prophets. And then Jesus gets more specific, and he asks Peter. He says, "Peter, who do you say that I am?" And he says very plainly, "You are the Christ." And then Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about him. That's another example of the messianic secret. Here, I think it's pretty simple why Jesus wants them to keep it secret, and that's because they don't understand what it means for him to be the Messiah in the first place, and there isn't any value in them teaching and talking about Jesus as the Messiah from their context, because they're just going to get it wrong anyway. They don't understand what Messiah looks like, and he doesn't need them to preach half truths. They don't understand what the Messiah looks like. They only have partial vision. He doesn't want them wandering around saying the Messiah looks like a tree walking around. In fact, what Jesus is doing is redefining the Messiah in light of the messianic expectation of Second Temple Judaism. We've talked about that before, that messianic expectation. And now we need to kind of delve deeper into demonstrating what they really, really believed. The first thing that we can do is do what we call mirror read. And we can use the New Testament to do that. When we mirror read, we look at descriptions of things, and then we say, okay, if this is how it's being described or talked about or presented, then the reflection of what it really is must be like this. For example, Jesus' rebuke of Peter in this chapter and in other passages of the New Testament, we can kind of see that. In fact, we can look ahead here in 8:31 through 9:1 and see Jesus teach about the Messiah and mirror read. So if the Messiah is going to suffer and going to be abused and going to be hurt and going to be put out and is going to suffer and is going to die. See, we're describing that the Messiah is really more like a suffering servant, an Isaiah 53 type of another idea. And we can get a little bit of a feel for that. But you know what? That stands in stark contrast. If we want to really see what the Messiah is going to be like, then we need to look to some other Second Temple literature and see how the Messiah is described in that messianic expectation. If we want to find what we can find several texts that hold this messianic expectation of Second Temple Judaism, and we can read those and by implication figure out what their expectation exactly was. Now, I've told you that the Messiah in Second Temple Judaism was basically seen as a military or a political leader who was going to redeem them from political oppression. And now I want to kind of show you some text that we can use to actually talk about that. The first text that we might look at is Second Esdras, chapter 12, verses 31 through 36, and that's actually in the Apocrypha. And I have it set up for you over here. I'm looking at it on my iPad, and actually gotten down to Second Esdras. You can see here. I just Googled Second Esdras, and the Apocrypha actually in the New Revised Standard Version is actually on Bible Gateway, which is a great website. I'm going to turn on the reader view to make it just a little bit easier. And we said this is where? This is in Second Esdras 12. And instead of going to 1, let's try going to 12. And then turn the reader view back on. And now what verses are we in? Verses 31 through 36. Let's scroll down and look at those verses. Here we see the Messiah described as a lion. Let me just read this for you here, starting here in verse 31. And as for the lion whom you saw rousing up out of the forest and roaring and speaking to the eagle and reproving him for his unrighteousness, and as for all his words that you have heard, this is the Messiah whom the Most High has kept until the end of days, who will arise from the offspring of David and will come and speak with him. He will denounce them for their ungodliness and for their wickedness, and will display before them their contemptuous dealings. For first he will bring them alive before his judgment seat, and when he has reproved them, then he will destroy them. But in mercy he will set free the remnant of my people, those who have been saved throughout my borders. And he will make them joyful until the end comes, the day of judgment of which I spoke to you at the beginning. This is the dream that you saw, and this is its interpretation. And you alone were worthy to learn this secret of the Most High. Therefore, write all these things that you have seen in a book and put it in a hidden place. And you shall teach them. And it goes on there. But so we see the description described as a roaring lion. And he's going to come out of the forest. He's the offspring of David. He's going to judge them for their ungodliness and for all of their evil doings. He's going to bring them before the judgment seat, and he's going to destroy them. But a remnant will receive mercy, and he will take good care of them. Let's look now over at another passage. Now here we're in a book. The larger name of the book is the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and there's a chapter for each of the 12 patriarchs, and we need to scan down and find the one on Judah. And it's Judah. There's Simeon. There's Levi. I think Judah's next. Let's see here. Come on up on it. Yep, here's Judah. Now we're in chapter 24. These are really short chapters. Verse 24, chapter 24. Okay, here we go. Now here, instead of a lion, he talks about it as a star. After these things shall a star arise to you from Jacob in peace, and a man shall arise from my seed, like the Son of righteousness, walking with the Son of men in meekness and in righteousness. And no sin shall be found in him. And the heavens shall be opened unto him, to pour out the Spirit, even the blessing of the Holy Father. And he shall pour out the Spirit of grace upon you, and he shall and he shall be unto him sons in truth, and he shall walk in his commandments first and last. This branch of God Most High, and this fountain giving life to all. Then shall the scepter of my kingdom shine forth, and from your root shall arise a stem, and from it shall grow a rod of righteousness to the Gentiles, to judge and to save all that call upon the Lord. So here we describe him as a star, a sun, as bright. He comes walking down amongst us. He has power. He calls out the righteous, and he even calls out the righteous of the Gentiles to serve and to be with him. Now, finally, we're going to look at the Testament of Solomon, and I want to show you the reader view here. The Testament of Solomon, and chapters 17 and 18, let's look at this paragraph right here that starts, and the children of the covenant in the midst of the mingled people surpassed them in evil. There was not among them one that wrought in the midst of Jerusalem mercy and truth. They that loved the synagogues of the pious fled from them, as sparrows that fly from the nest. They wandered in deserts, that their lives might be saved from harm. And precious in the eyes of them that lived abroad was any that escaped alive from them. Over the whole earth they were scattered by lawless men. For the heavens withheld the rain from dropping upon earth. Springs were stopped that sprang perennially out of the depths, that ran down from the lofty mountains. There was none among them that wrought righteous and justice. From the chief of them to the least of them, all were sinful. The king was a transgressor, and the judge disobedient, and the people sinful. Behold, O Lord, and raise up to them their king, the son of David, at the time in the which thou seest, O God, that he may reign over Israel thy servant, and gird him with strength, that he may shatter unrighteous rulers, and that he may purge Jerusalem from nations that trample her down to destruction. Wisely, righteously, he shall thrust out sinners from the inheritance. He shall destroy the pride of the sinner, as a potter's vessel. With a rod of iron he shall break in pieces all their substance. He shall destroy the godless nations with the word of his mouth. At his rebuke, nations shall flee before him, and he shall reprove sinners for the thoughts of their hearts. And he shall gather together a holy people, whom he shall lead in righteousness. And he shall judge the tribes of the people that have been sanctified by the Lord his God. And he shall not suffer unrighteousness to lodge any more in their midst, nor shall there dwell with them any man that knoweth wickedness, for he shall know them, that they are all the sons of their God. And he shall divide them according to their tribes upon the land, and neither sojourner nor alien shall sojourn with them any more. He shall judge peoples and nations in the wisdom of his righteousness. Selah. So you see in these three passages all of those elements. In fact, if you were to go back and look at the Psalm of Solomon, the Psalms of Solomon, chapters 17 and 18, and read that whole section, you would get a very detailed description of what Second Temple Jews thought the Messiah was going to be like. Even in that section that I read, you can clearly see he's coming to Jerusalem. He's going to purge Jerusalem. He's going to chase all the unrighteous out. They're going to conquer everything from there. He's going to reorganize them, and they're going to begin to rule with him. If you were to read all of those 2 chapters, you would see that in great detail. And so now you got a better idea. If that's what the disciples are thinking and that's their expectation, Jesus surely doesn't want them teaching that he's the Messiah if this is what everybody's thinking. Now in this section here, in 21 through 9:1, he reteaches, realigns their proper view of Messiah and tries to help them understand that. In fact, in the next section, starting here in chapter 9, verse 2, through the end of chapter, I think it's through the end of chapter 13, or at least through verse 37, Jesus is going to enter into conflict. That's the rest of the journey to Jerusalem and a chunk of the Jerusalem ministry. Jesus is entering into conflict with many individuals. But he also, through that conflict, is going to develop what it really means to be Messiah and what the implications for being a disciple of that Messiah are. Now that we better understand the expectations for the Messiah, maybe we can better understand the difficulty that the disciples had in accepting what Jesus was teaching. Their minds are formed on that. And when you know something and you're confident in that knowledge, even if you learn that it's wrong, it's hard for you to get those blinders off. Maybe you can get your attention, but even if you get the blinders off, your mind goes back to it means this. And you've got to constantly, until you unlearn that, you're still looking around and you're describing Jesus like the blind man initially described the people around him. They look like trees walking. What the disciples need to do is they need to have clear sight so that they don't see Jesus as like a tree walking, but they see him as a dead man walking. And understand that if they are going to follow him, they too are going to have to become dead men and walking. Look, I love this. Mark knew how difficult this would have been for the disciples. And he wants us to understand that Jesus is not kind of hiding. He's not talking figuratively about this kind of suffering. It's not a metaphor for the spiritual life. It is the real life that brings about the spirituality that Jesus desired. Look. Right here, I'm picking up in verse 21. And Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And after 3 days rise again. Look at verse 32. And he said this plainly. Mark is saying this wasn't double talk. Jesus wasn't winking. Jesus wasn't saying, anything along those lines. He's talking straight out to them. And you can also see that Mark lets us know the disciples understood he was talking plainly, because look at what happens in the rest of verse 32. Peter took Jesus aside and he began to rebuke him. That's comical. If the implications of it weren't so significant, it would be straight up slapstick. Peter takes Jesus aside, and Peter tells Jesus, "No, Jesus, you're wrong about Messiah. I've studied this. I've learned this since I was a boy, and that's not what Messiah's like." And Jesus looks at him like, "What?" But look at verse 33. Don't get down on Peter. Peter's the spokesman. He's not the loudmouth, not the one who's going off the deep end. That's one of my pet peeves about Peter, people talking about Peter. He only says what everybody else is thinking. Everybody else was too much of a coward to say it. Peter's bold enough to say it. Peter's bold enough to take action. But look at here, verse 33. I'm proving that to you. Look at here. But turning and seeing the disciples, see, Jesus is looking at the disciples, and he knows all the rest of them are thinking the same thing Peter's just said. And he rebukes Peter, and he gives him really the strongest rebuke that he gives anyone in the biblical text. He says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan." Yes, he's calling him Satan. Who is Satan? Satan is the one. All right, we know that Satan is a particular spiritual being that is one of God's enemies. But the idea of Satan is just someone who speaks falsely, who speaks against the will and the way of the Lord. And he tells him here, you've got your thing, you've got your mind. Look here, into verse 33. For you are setting your mind on the things of God, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. That's Satan. That's satanic influence. That's following that pattern of being an accuser or a slanderer. He doesn't have his mind on it. He's not ready. And then Jesus doesn't just thrash him. He gets his attention. He rebukes him. But if you read on in verse 34, he calls the crowd back together with all of his disciples, and he begins to teach them what it really means to be a disciple. And this teaching that we find here in 34 through 9:1, we'll find it at lengthier terms, parallel passages, but lengthier passages, especially in Luke. In Luke chapter 9, very similar type discussion and very similar type words. Deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me. That's straight in Luke, and he talks about it in greater detail there. And we see here, this in chapter 8 is Jesus' first prediction of his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And so he puts the focus of the disciples on his death and his suffering, and he puts the focus on there because that's the life of a disciple. And he's going to not only predict his death here in chapter 8, but Jesus is going to do it at two more locations on the journey to Jerusalem, once in chapter 10, once in chapter 9, and once in chapter 10. And so boom, 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 all the way through here, he's going to reveal to him what it really means for him to be the Messiah. It's not this political leader, and what it really means for them to be disciples. It's not going to be people who fight alongside Jesus and sit on thrones and rule from Jerusalem. That's obviously what they were thinking. You can tell that by looking at their reactions and their attitudes and their words all through the Gospels. But now listen, after the resurrection, the disciples get it. After the death, burial, and resurrection, the disciples get it. And they begin to preach a message that's consistent with this in the early part of Acts. And we see them with announcing that consistently. And when the Apostle Paul joins in with Christianity, he understands this to better than anybody else. And go away, squirrel. He spends chapters talking about the life of the disciple as following Christ in the death, burial, and in the resurrection. I think we talked in our last lecture about Colossians chapter 2, starting about verse 20, going through chapter 3, verse 17. I won't bring all that up again, but this becomes the core teaching of what it means to be a disciple, and it's all based on passages like this in the Gospels. So this is the end of this lecture, and I hope you have a great day and enjoy the rest of the time with snow day and schoolwork, and let's enjoy that funky. Y'all have a great day.